Okay, we are still reading Prairie songs today. We're on chapter 4, page 37. Lester and me hunted tadpoles that afternoon, and I picked a bouquet of beautiful wildflowers that I split down the middle and shared with Mrs. Berryman. I gave her the cattail. Later, we gathered chips and gave them all to her to get them started. She wore those green gloves and handled the chips as if they were hot, burning her clear to the bone. And we even helped her stack them up, and then we pushed the wheelbarrow home, empty again. Here's the picture in case you don't have the book with you. For picking the flowers. See how flat that Nebraska prairie is? I was furious at Mama. Never once did she mention the books, and we never went inside again, but stood outside the study for parting words. Mrs. Berryman was all the while looking for either her husband or Indians to come riding over the rim of the prairie. I wouldn't even let Lester ride this time. I was so angry at Mama. "Mommy, you promised! You promised! What if she goes back to New York and takes all her books, and I never get a chance to see them?" "Patience, Louisa. I've invited Dr. and Mrs. Berryman for dinner in 2 days, and I have a plan, something better than just asking for you to browse through her books. Anyway, I seriously doubt they will go back to New York within the next week or so." Mama laughed. "She won't be traveling anymore with that little baby getting closer and closer to being born." "What plan?" "You'll see, Louisa. You'll see." And as I set the table 2 days later for our dinner guests, Mama still hadn't told me. She pushed the table up alongside the bed. "You and Lester sit on this side, Louisa, and use the tin dishes. And make sure you put the good forks alongside the china plates. You children take the crooked forks, please. And Louisa, try to remember some manners." "Mama, you already told me. How come you don't tell Lester that? He needs manners too, doesn't he?" "I'm referring to the kind of manners that have to do with a busy mouth, Louisa Downing, which is something I don't worry about with Lester." That hurt me. "I swear, sometimes I think you like Lester just because he don't talk." Mama pulled me to her suddenly, but I held myself real rigid. Louisa, that's not true. You know how I worry about Lester growing up out here and being so withdrawn and quiet." She held my face firmly to her warm chest, rubbing my ear between her fingers. "I am ever grateful that you are such a talkative, lively child, out here with nothing to stimulate you. What's stimulate?" "Oh, stimulate is to have fancy moldings, and lots of people and music, and streets and signs, and books, and civilized things. But I have a plan, Louisa. A plan for you and Lester, something to help you both." "Here they are!" yelled Lester from outside. He ran in, peered nervously through the window at the approaching wagon, and ran out again. While in Grand Island with Papa, Doc Berryman had bought himself a horse and a fine wagon, the most beautiful 2-seater wagon, painted shiny black, that looked sort of silly behind the plain gray horse. As they got closer, the doctor made the horse trot faster, and Mrs. Berryman held on to her bonnet. "William, William!" we could hear her laughing. "Good afternoon, good neighbors," Doc said, pulling up alongside the house. "I want you to know this is my first call in my splendid new vehicle, and I am glad to say it is on such pleasant business, and no one is sick or ailing." He reached out to touch Lester's head as he climbed down from the wagon, but Lester ducked him. "Lester, darling," Mrs. Berryman said, slipping off her seat and peering under the wagon, "I have something for you." She held out her hand, and I saw Lester snatch something. "And Louisa?" She turned to me and held out a little package wrapped in white paper. "Thank you, ma'am." To Mama she held out a bouquet of flowers, blue and purple, tied with a satin ribbon that was as pink as a newborn kitten's tongue. Mama led the doctor and Mrs. Berryman inside, and I stood there in the late afternoon sun and unwrapped the small package. Inside the crinkly paper was a heart-shaped piece of white gum with a sticker pasted on it, a rosy-cheeked angel with curly hair. I sniffed it, and a clear peppermint scent filled my head. "Look," Lester whispered. He had one too, but his sticker was a picture of a yellow bird. We stood staring at them. I popped it into my mouth, and it was sweeter than honey. "These must be what they eat in New York," he whispered, and his very words spun away from us in the warm breeze like a dry tumbleweed. When we finally went inside, Mrs. Berryman was standing in the center of the room, staring straight up. "Oh, Clara, what a wonderful idea!" There was a double length of muslin tacked to the ceiling, reflecting light and keeping the dirt from sprinkling down on us. "William, we must do that. Find out how Mr. Downing did it." She smiled sweetly at Papa, who reddened. "Well, actually," Papa stammered, "I didn't do it. It was Clara. I'm sure she'd be glad to show you how." I could have shown her, too. We always helped Mama, Lester, and me with the ceiling cover when it was time to wash it. Then Mama would hammer the muslin up, spitting out dust as it rained down on her, and we would hold the ends and hand up nails to her, the dirt stinging our eyes. We all sat around a tightly packed table as Mama passed the serving plates. Doc and Mrs. Berryman got the chairs, Lester and me sat on the bed, and Mama and Papa sat on the 2 barrels, making Papa especially tall. I peeked under the table to see his 2 feet on each side of the barrel. He winked at me and stooped over a little more. "This dinner smells wonderful," Mrs. Berryman said, fingering the silverware by her plate. "I'm afraid I'm not a very good cook." Doc patted her hand and smiled, not at her, but around at the rest of us. "She's a fine cook, just fine." Mama held the bowl of green beans out to her and seemed to study her face. "Well, it may be a little different, cooking out here without vegetable carts and a wide choice of things all the time, but you'll learn, Emmeline. We do. We all do." Mrs. Berryman's cheeks were once again splotched, and her delicate neck became mottled before my eyes. She slipped her hand out from under her husband's. "I don't know. I grew up in a house with servants and a cook. It's hard for me." Mama looked startled. "Yes, Emmeline dear," the doctor said, "but you did cook for a year when we were first married. Before we came here, I think you managed quite well." "Did you have slaves, Mrs. Berryman?" I asked, knowing something but very little about the nature of servants. "No," she began, but Doc cleared his throat and started talking loudly to Papa. "Carney Whitfield has agreed to take me on an expedition of the county to meet some of the people in the area and to let them know my services are available. I thought I would start as soon as possible while the weather is still in my favor." Doc had turned from his wife and was directing himself to Papa. The Doc's mustache was as black and shiny as his new wagon, and his eyebrows were softer and stuck out from his brow. "I'm anxious to meet the people and set up some kind of system for my services." Mama smoothed her skirts. "Oh, I'm sure they'll all be delighted to meet you, but be prepared to see the results of some mighty poor doctoring. They've all done without for a long time. They've been making do all on their own." Papa chuckled and bit off a piece of hard bread. He held up his small, crooked finger in front of himself as if to admire it. "Oh, I don't know, Clara. You didn't do too bad for yourself." Doc grabbed Papa's finger and felt for the bone. "Your handiwork, Clara." Mama blushed. "In a pinch, Doc, in a pinch." "I could re-break it for you, JT, and set it right. Give you more use of it." Papa pulled back his hand. "I get plenty of use, that's for certain." "Who knows if we would have lost Delilah if you'd been here sooner?" "I often think of that." Mama pushed the rice around her plate, and everyone grew quiet. "Emmeline told me you lost your child, Clara. I'm sorry to hear it. Let's hope things will be better for you now." Seemed awfully proud to me, in a way I wasn't sure I liked. "You mean nobody's gonna die anymore?" It was Lester, and we all stared at him in surprise, except the doctor, who didn't realize that Lester never spoke to anyone like that. He sipped his coffee. "That would be nice, son. That certainly would be a nice goal." Mama laughed. "Imagine that. Nebraska, the state where nobody ever dies anymore. Goodness, would we have people settling in these parts like some kind of gold rush?" And she ruffled Lester's hair playfully. "I need to make another stop at Grand Island," the doctor went on, "and see if those medical supplies have arrived yet. We sent them separately. I hope they come soon." "Things are slow around here," Papa said, "especially the mail, although sometimes it'll surprise you." "Oh, I do hope the cradle gets here in time," Mrs. Berryman said. "My parents are having a cradle shipped out from New York. It was imported from Germany, and Mother says it's beautiful. She wouldn't let me look at it before I left. Said it was bad luck." "We slept in drawers when we were babies," I announced. Papa smiled at me. "That's right, and when you were too noisy I just shut the drawer, said, 'Good night, little sparrow,' and away you went." Oh dear, I guess a cradle is pretty frivolous for prairie life. Mrs. Berryman was looking at me. "Not at all," Mama assured her. "I can't wait to see it." When all the bowls were empty, Mama suggested we sit outside and eat our applesauce, made from apples imported from Philadelphia. It was cooler out, and the sun was beginning to turn the sky a sweet apricot color. We set the chairs and barrels facing the sun and ate our dessert sprinkled delicately with fine cinnamon. Doc pulled out a pipe from his pocket and stuffed it with tobacco. He offered Papa his pouch, but Papa refused. I knew he had a corncob pipe inside, but I also knew it was cracked. It's so peaceful, Mama sighed. So empty, Mrs. Berryman said. Her small bowl sat atop her belly, and she looked all around her. Sometimes I think I see shadows moving, maybe Indians coming or thieves. Emmeline, scolded the doctor between puffs. You have read too many adventure stories. There are no Indians out here anymore. There are, said Papa thoughtfully. He cupped his two hands around the bowl and stared out at the horizon. Nothing bad's ever happened to us, though. There aren't many left anymore, but once in a while they come and look around, and then they leave. I told you, William, Mrs. Berryman said, leaning forward and looking into her husband's face. She sat back again and glared at the setting sun. He doesn't believe me half the time. Clara, the doctor asked Mama abruptly, are you armed? Mama half smiled. Not at the moment. But do you keep a gun in the house? Yes, there's a rifle. It's for hunting and protection if we should ever need it. Do you know how to shoot it? Yes. Mama waited. Maybe you could show Emmeline. William, I couldn't shoot a gun. I won't. Papa set his empty bowl on the ground next to him and rubbed his hands thoughtfully on the rim of the seat. That's not such a bad idea, Mrs. Berryman. Not that you'll need it, but just in case. There will be times when I'll be away for a few days, Em, and I would feel better about you and the baby if I knew you were armed. His mustache twitched. Mrs. Berryman visibly softened at the mention of the baby, as the doctor had probably known she would. She stood up and once again scanned the horizon as if she were expecting someone. Oh, I don't know, William. I just don't know. It frightens me. Don't be such a child, he said sternly. I had never heard Papa talk to Mama that way, and I guess I was staring in wide-eyed amazement because Mama caught my eye and pursed her lips together as if she were about to warn me. But she stood up and said, Come, Emmeline, and see my vegetable garden. It's doing so well this year, I can give you some fresh things to take home with you. Mrs. Berryman seemed as grateful as I was to leave the quiet gathering in front of the soddy and the man who scolded her so easily. Lester ran ahead. Midway between the house and the river was a square of dark earth that Mama always fussed over, forcing it to bear its yearly crop of vegetables. She churned manure into the soil in the autumn and lugged buckets of water up from the river or down from the well all spring and summer. A cloud of dust followed us down to the garden, and Lester disappeared into its bushes of tomatoes and spears of standing corn. I worry about the children out here, Mama was saying, with it being so wild and uncultured and all. Mrs. Berryman was quiet, listening. And I've thought up something. Mama stopped and faced the other woman, and then started on again, her steps as hesitant as the words she was searching for. I know how hard it is for you to carry water now that you're so far along, and well, I was thinking that laundry might be difficult for you, and seeing as how we have a pump, I was wondering if I'd like to suggest that maybe. I walked up beside Mama, watching my bare feet walk along while my whole body seemed to be waiting years. I'd be glad to do your laundry chores for you in return for your teaching Louisa and Lester here a little reading and writing, and maybe some arithmetic, just so they don't grow up totally. Mrs. Berryman stopped suddenly. I'm not a qualified teacher, Clara, not at all. But you may be the best chance they ever have, Emmeline. There are no schools yet in this part of the country. You have books, and you could teach them maybe just a couple of days a week. Mama reached out and touched Emmeline's arm. And Lester, I'm so worried about him. He says so little. It's unnatural, his quietness. Maybe if he could read, and he seems to like you a bit. I suddenly realized how hard it was for Mama to do this. I was torn between the joy of maybe having Mrs. Berryman teach me, and the shame of seeing my Mama ask so hard for something. She looked like a walnut again. Mrs. Berryman stood there, fingering her delicate straw hat in her hands. I hadn't thought of ever doing anything like that. She looked back at her husband, his chair tilted against the light side of the house alongside Papa. But you know, it might be good for me as well to have such important work to do. She smiled at me. Would you like to go to my school, Louisa? Oh, yes, ma'am, yes, I would. And I would help you, too. Tote clothes for you and bring you butter and help you tack your muslin overhead and keep your books piled neat. She and Mama laughed. And you, Lester, what do you think? Mrs. Berryman reached down to touch Lester's back as he knelt in the dirt by her feet. But he shot off like a jackrabbit before she could. In the dirt, though, he had scraped out the only word he knew how to write. A word Mama had taught him during the winter when we were worried about the snow that was piled heavy on our roof. It said, Lester.